Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something a little more blasphemous than usual. A whisper, a gospel, and then a bonfire. Welcome to the strange, smouldering world of Gnosticism, where everything you know is fake, the god you worship is a fraud, and your soul is being held hostage in a body made of filth. Cozy, right? So before you slip into that fuzzy blanket and drift off to dreams of enlightenment, maybe hit that like button, unless it's just another illusion cast by the demiurge, to trap your divine spark in algorithmic despair. In which case, I guess, good luck. Now, let's take a deep breath. Exhale slowly, and imagine you've just been labelled a heretic by the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. Not because you were causing trouble, not because you were starting riots or desecrating altars, but because you believed that the god of this world was a cosmic imposter, and you said it, out loud, in Occitan, within earshot of a Dominican friar who was holding a pen and a list with your name on it. It's the 13th century. You live in southern France, which is about to become a spiritual war zone. You believe in something called Gnosis, a secret knowledge passed down not by priests, but by prophets, mystics, and people with way too much time to think about why the world feels like a prison. You look around and see suffering, corruption, greed, war, and instead of saying, God's mysterious ways, you say, this whole place is run by a sadistic architect with anger issues. Bold, blasphemous, brave, and incredibly dumb if you enjoy being alive. Because now the church knows, and the church does not do well with alternative cosmologies, or people who say the Pope is working for the cosmic janitor who botched the universe. To be fair, the Gnostics weren't trying to start a rebellion. Most of them were just trying to escape the trap of the flesh, which, according to their worldview, is disgusting. Your body, in this theology, is a haunted meat cage. Earth is a divine mistake. The only way out is through enlightenment, purification, and never touching cheese again. That's right. The Cathars, southern Europe's most famous Gnostics, renounced meat, dairy, sex, marriage, and basically everything fun. Not because they were prudes, but because they believed indulging the body meant feeding the illusion. The world is not real, they said, but your suffering is, and the more you embrace it, the more likely your soul can slip past the cosmic guard dogs and get back to the light. Sounds poetic, until you remember that the people in charge really liked cheese, and wives, and power. So tonight, you're not a peasant or a priest, you're a spiritual insurgent, a soft-spoken radical who just told the wrong monk that heaven isn't reached through sacraments but through silence, through suffering, through death. You don't want gold, you don't want glory, you want escape. Which is unfortunate, because what you're about to get is fire. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where being right about the nature of reality is a fast way to become one with smoke. Your first mistake was thinking your body was yours, that this flesh, this skin, this clumsy, aching sack of bones had anything to do with your true self. It doesn't. Not according to the Gnostics. According to them, you're divine, eternal, a fragment of light from beyond the stars, and you're stuck, wedged into a physical form built by a lesser god who flunked metaphysics and got promoted anyway. His name is the Demiurge. He's not a villain exactly, just a cosmic bureaucrat with control issues and a bad aesthetic sense. He thinks this world is good. He thinks you should be grateful. Meanwhile, you're getting paper cuts, arthritis, and intrusive thoughts. The body is a lie, the world is a trap, and the prison guards wear halos. The Gnostics believed that everything you see, everything you touch, everything you're told to love, is a kind of spiritual bait. Family, food, status, religion. It's all part of the machinery. The church tells you God made the world and saw that it was good. The Gnostics say, actually no. He made the world and then tried to cover his tracks. He gave you rules. He gave you shame. He gave you Sunday morning sermons about obedience. Not so you'd thrive, but so you'd forget. Forget that you came from light, that you're not a sinner, but a hostage, that your body is a costume stitched by cosmic error. It gets worse. The people running the show, priests, bishops, emperors, they're not just mistaken, they're complicit. They tell you to bow, to kneel, to repent. But what they're really doing is reinforcing the dream. They want you to think salvation comes from them, that you're broken, that you need fixing, that your soul is a bank account and the church is the only ATM. But the Gnostics say, no, the truth isn't in the cathedral, it's in the silence beneath your suffering. The ache in your chest isn't sin, it's memory. You remember a world without pain, without death, without this nauseating, glorious, awful thing called matter. So what do you do with this truth? You whisper it, carefully, to someone you trust, someone who also avoids the market on feast days and doesn't eat animals with faces. You gather in secret, you share dreams, you renounce marriage, you try not to exist too much, because the more you embrace the body, the more you forget the soul, and forgetting, in this theology, is the worst sin of all. But the demiurge is not subtle, his world has spies, and when you say too much, or live too strangely, or stop paying your tithes, someone notices, and once they notice, they call you dangerous, not because you're violent, but because you've seen the curtain pulled back, and now they have to remind you who's in charge, with chains, with trials, with fire, and they'll call it justice. But it's just the prison defending itself. It's the year 1209, you live in southern France. The sky is blue, the hills are quiet, and the church has just declared war on your entire region. Not a metaphorical war, not a theological debate with stern letters and awkward silences. No, this is a full-blown crusade, with horses, swords, and soldiers who think forgiveness is best delivered through blunt force trauma. The Albigensian Crusade, they call it, named after the town of Albi, but really it's about you, or rather what you believe, which is unfortunate because what you believe is heresy, and not the cute kind where people roll their eyes and change the subject. This is the dangerous kind, the kind that says the Pope has no authority, the sacraments don't matter, and the God of this world is an imposter. You didn't want a war, you just wanted to reject cheese and transcend matter. But now God is loading a crossbow, and he's aiming it directly at your village. The men coming for you wear white crosses and call themselves the Army of Christ. They've been promised indulgences, land, maybe even some wine-soaked loot if they survive the campaign. Most of them don't speak your language. They don't need to. They're not here to chat. They're here to cleanse. And you're what needs scrubbing. Not because you sinned, but because you stopped believing the right things in the right order, under the right authority. You were supposed to confess, conform, and contribute. Instead, you questioned, you fasted, you listened to a travelling perfectus under the olive tree one evening and started thinking too much. That's all it takes. The Pope's official message is clear. Eradicate the heresy. Not discourage it. Not out-argue it. Eradicate, like weeds, like vermin, like spiritual termites chewing through the wooden frame of Christendom. And your local lord, who may or may not agree with you, is now caught between his faith and his neck, because sheltering heretics is suddenly a capital offence, and even neutrality smells like disobedience, so your neighbours start disappearing. Some flee to the hills, others pretend they never knew you. A few stay and try to negotiate with the advancing army. Spoiler, it doesn't work. The church has spoken. The plan isn't diplomacy, it's demonstration. They reach Béziers first, a city filled with both Catholics and Cathars. When someone asks how to tell them apart, the commander famously replies, "Kill them all. God will know his own." And then the massacre begins. Not a battle, a bloodbath. Men, women, children, everyone. Burned, stabbed, crushed, erased. And the message spreads faster than the flames. This isn't just punishment, it's theatre. Theatrical theology with swords and smoke. You stand on a hillside watching the smoke curl into the heavens. You wonder if the souls rising with it will find their way to the true God, or if they'll just reincarnate in a worse town. You were right, you realise. The world is a prison, and the warden is feeling especially righteous today. The Cathars had a simple message. The world is garbage, not just metaphorically, literally. Everything around you, your body, your food, your possessions, your desires, it's all part of a divine mistake, or worse, a cosmic con job. The real God, the one made of pure light and wisdom, didn't create this mess. The demiurge did, a jealous, deranged architect who confused power with perfection and ended up building a universe full of hunger, aging, and taxes. The Cathars didn't hate life exactly, they just didn't trust it. Which is fair, considering how it ends. They believed the soul was a divine spark, trapped in flesh like a pearl inside a rotting peach. The goal wasn't salvation, it was escape, and for that belief, we decided they had to die. Let's be clear, Cathars didn't burn churches, didn't riot in the streets, didn't start uprisings. Their heresy was quiet, philosophical, polite even. They sat in circles and sang. They renounced violence. They fasted. They meditated. They avoided meat and sex, not because they were joyless, but because they didn't want to feed the illusion. They believed that indulgence tied the soul tighter to the body, and the body, in their view, was the problem. So they practiced detachment, serenity, and spiritual discipline. Naturally, this made them a threat, because the Church of Rome, with its gold, its cathedrals, and its absolute insistence that everything ran through its sacraments, did not appreciate being called spiritually obsolete. So the response was fire, literal fire. Hundreds of Cathars were marched to pyres and burned alive, not because they'd hurt anyone, but because they refused to lie. They wouldn't recant. They wouldn't kiss the cross. They wouldn't pretend that matter was good just to save their skins. In fact, some of them welcomed the flames, because in their worldview, death was not the end. It was an upgrade. The soul, finally released from its meat prison, could return to the divine source. The fire wasn't destruction, it was purification. To them, martyrdom was just the shortest route out of the simulation. This, of course, made things worse, because nothing frustrates an executioner like a victim who doesn't scream, who doesn't resist, who smiles while they burn. The church thought it was teaching a lesson, but the Cathars turned it into a sermon, one with crackling wood and rising smoke. Even as they died, they made a point. That truth is not always loud. That silence can be defiant. That you can kill the body, but not the message. So we burned them, over and over again, in fields, in courtyards, in ditches, hoping the smoke would carry away their heresy, hoping the crowds would see a warning, not a miracle. But for every body reduced to ash, the idea spread, that maybe the world was wrong, that maybe flesh was not freedom, that maybe burning the body only proves the soul is real, and very hard to silence. Here's a thought. What if the world isn't fallen? It's just fake, not broken, but built that way. According to the Cathars and other Gnostics, you're not here because you messed up. You're here because someone else did. A cosmic programmer made a glitchy reality and called it divine, and now you're trapped inside it, forced to play by rules you didn't write, worship a deity you didn't choose, and suffer consequences you didn't earn. Welcome to Earth. Population duped souls. This isn't punishment for sin, it's a test of memory. Can you remember who you really are before the simulation consumes you? In Gnostic thought, the material world isn't just a distraction, it's a counterfeit. Everything from gravity to guilt is part of the system. Your pain, your cravings, your mortality, all features, not bugs. The being who built this place, the demiurge, thinks he's God, but he's more like the night manager of a failing restaurant, clinging to authority he was never qualified to have. He made the physical realm, declared it good, and then locked the exit. He's not evil exactly, just delusional. And because he's delusional, the world is too. That means your instincts are not sins, they're security breaches. When you dream of something higher, when you feel disgusted by suffering, when you crave beauty that doesn't rot, that's not rebellion. That's memory. That's the soul glitching against its cage. The church calls it temptation. The Gnostics called it awakening. You're not wicked, you're homesick. And homesickness, in this theology, is dangerous. It makes you question things, like why pain exists, or why a loving God needs so many weapons, or why religious authorities keep insisting obedience is a form of grace. You start wondering if maybe this entire structure, temples, priests, kings, nations, is built on the wrong blueprint. You start to suspect that the system is rigged, and if it's rigged, maybe your job isn't to conform, maybe it's to escape. But escape doesn't mean violence. Gnostics weren't revolutionaries with swords, they were mystics with metaphors. Escape meant knowledge, not information, but gnosis, inner knowing, the kind that can't be taught or preached, only remembered. They believed enlightenment came from stripping away illusion, every desire dropped, every lie rejected, every attachment cut loose, until only the soul remained, silent, weightless, ready to ascend. To most people that sounded crazy, or worse, ungrateful. What kind of person spits on creation and calls it a prison? What kind of fool sees a sunrise and mutters, "Nice simulation"? But the Cathars weren't trying to be liked. They were trying to wake up, and once you wake up in the wrong reality, no amount of pleasure can put you back to sleep. So you fast, you pray, you let go, and if the world punishes you for rejecting it, that's fine. It just proves what you already suspected. This was never the real world anyway. Imagine someone built a house with no windows, uneven floors, and a ceiling that leaks existential dread. Then imagine they installed themselves as landlord, declared the design perfect, and started charging rent in the form of suffering. That's the demiurge. In Gnostic theology, he's not the devil. Not exactly. He's worse, because he thinks he's the hero. This being didn't create the universe out of love. He created it out of ego. He wanted to be worshipped. He wanted control. So he took divine fragments of the real world, sparks of true light, and trapped them in meat. Then he made rules. Then he made you. His name comes from Greek, demiurgos, the craftsman. But don't let the title fool you. This isn't an artisan. This is a cosmic foreman with boundary issues. The demiurge didn't make reality. He made the simulation. According to the Gnostics, the real world exists beyond time, beyond form, beyond matter. It's pure, eternal, silent, and unreachable, unless you wake up. But the demiurge doesn't want that. He wants compliance. So he built a world that bleeds, a world that tempts, a world that says, "Obey me," or "suffer," and then makes suffering happen either way. You might be thinking, why would he hate me? What did I do? And that's the thing. You didn't do anything. You just exist. You're a soul, a fragment of the true divine, stuck inside his cheap knockoff universe. You remind him of what he isn't, and he resents it. The more you awaken, the more he wants you distracted. So he gives you distractions. Food, fear, war, religion, guilt, social status. The demiurge isn't subtle. He's loud, jealous, and petty. He built pyramids of power to keep you down. Empires, dogmas, institutions, then handed them to people who enforce his vision like unpaid interns of damnation. And here's the twist. Most people worship him, not out of love, but because they've forgotten there's anyone else. The God of this world demands prayers, punishes doubt, rewards obedience, and floods your life with arbitrary tests. Sound familiar? It should. The Gnostics believed that most of organized religion is just the demiurge's fan club, elaborate systems to keep the soul distracted. The more sacred it looks, the more suspicious it is. Because true divinity doesn't need worship, it just is. But the demiurge, he needs validation constantly. That's why he micromanages your dreams and counts your sins like an insecure accountant. So now you're here, in a world that praises pain, demands belief, and punishes clarity. The walls are illusions, the sky is wallpaper, and the architect, he thinks he's God. But the truth is, he's afraid of you. Because you're the evidence that something better exists. You're the glitch, the reminder, the rebel spark. And the more you remember that, the more dangerous you become. Bad news. You're not climbing a golden staircase into heaven. You're not getting wings. You're not meeting St. Peter at the gates. You're dying, gasping, letting go, and then waking up again in a slightly worse situation with slightly fewer teeth. Welcome to the Gnostic version of reincarnation. It's not mystical. It's not majestic. It's a loop. A cold, impersonal software reboot run by a system that wants your soul to stay trapped indefinitely. You're not being punished for your sins. You're being recycled for your ignorance. According to Cathar belief, death doesn't solve anything unless you've achieved gnosis, true spiritual understanding, not belief, not piety, not memorizing the right creed. Gnosis, that rare internal click that breaks the illusion and lets the soul slip through the cracks of matter. Without it, you go right back in. New flesh, same trap. Maybe this time you're a merchant, maybe you're a laborer, maybe you're born with a limp or a disease or an urge to ask too many questions. And once again, the demiurge resets the board. New distractions, new body, same cage. This isn't the comforting version of reincarnation where you're ascending toward higher forms or coming back as a cat if you're lucky. This is spiritual house arrest with infinite forms of probation. You're not moving up, you're just moving sideways or down. And the criteria isn't karma, it's forgetfulness. Every time you fail to remember the truth, that the world is fake, the flesh is a lie, and your soul doesn't belong here, you fall back asleep. And when you fall asleep, the simulation wins. Again. The Cathars believed that only those who lived like the perfecti, the pure ones, could break the cycle. That meant no marriage, no meat, no sex, no property, no distractions. In other words, nothing. You have to give up everything that attaches you to the world. You have to walk lightly, like your body is on loan and your voice is not for decoration. You have to stop wanting, stop clinging, stop playing the game. Only then does the trap weaken. Only then can the spark find its way back to the source. But most people don't. Most people die exactly as they lived, distracted, full of opinions, and convinced they were right about everything. So the loop continues. You close your eyes thinking you've passed the test, and you wake up crying in a different cradle. You're back in the dirt, wearing new skin, with no idea you've done this a dozen times before, and nobody tells you, because nobody remembers. So no, you're not heading to paradise. You're heading to market, to a job, to another hollow routine where your soul quietly withers behind your ribcage, and you'll call it life, and you'll call it real, and only when it ends, again, will you feel the ache that says, wait, haven't I been here before? You have, but maybe this time you'll remember before it's too late. You'd think the head of Christendom might respond to heresy with prayer, maybe a counsel, maybe a strongly worded letter written on parchment and sealed with concern. But no. In 1209, Pope Innocent III receives word that southern France has become spiritually unstable. Too many Cathars, too many perfecti, too many peasants saying things like, the material world is evil, and the church is a gilded fraud. So he does what any reasonable shepherd of souls would do. He declares a crusade, not against Muslims, not in Jerusalem, but against other Christians, other Europeans, against you. And with a quill stroke, you go from eccentric to enemy of God. He doesn't send missionaries, he sends knights, whole armies of them, thousands of men with swords, crossbows, and the full permission of heaven to use them. Because apparently, the gospel needs help being understood, and nothing clarifies doctrine like a siege. These aren't gentle nudges toward repentance. These are holy battalions, crusaders who've been promised not only spiritual rewards, but land, titles, and whatever loot they can rip from heretical hands. This is not pastoral correction, this is a campaign. They come in banners and boots, speaking different dialects, singing songs about blood and paradise. Some are sincere, some just want to murder without consequences. The Pope, sitting comfortably in Rome, tells them this is God's will, that southern France must be purified, that the weeds must be torn out before the wheat can grow. And the Cathars, peaceful, unarmed, fasting, praying Cathars, are classified as weeds. Your local lords are torn. Some believe the Cathars aren't dangerous, others worry about their own necks. But neutrality is treason now. The Pope's army is coming, and it doesn't ask questions. It just advances, town after town, village after village. Surrender isn't always an option, and when it is, it doesn't help. Béziers surrendered, then it was massacred. Carcassonne negotiated, then it was stripped. The message is clear. Heresy is contagious, and the only cure is fire. If you're lucky, you flee. If you're not, you hide. If you're caught, you're interrogated, asked to confess, to renounce, to betray your neighbours, and even then, your chances aren't good, because once you're accused, the burden is yours to disprove. And how do you prove you don't believe something? How do you deny a heresy without sounding suspiciously fluent in it? This isn't theology, it's theatre. The Pope isn't writing sermons anymore, he's writing military orders, and you're the footnote, somewhere between burn the town and bless the troops. So the church sends you love, and soldiers, and a message. That salvation is only for those who obey. That truth is dangerous when unsupervised, and that God, apparently, now wears armour. He's coming up the road. Congratulations, you've taken the plunge. or rather the renunciation. You are now officially a Cathar. Welcome to the least indulgent spiritual path in medieval Europe. No icons, no churches, no robes, relics, incense or gold. You don't even get a Bible because you already know the truth. The world is a lie. So why decorate it? This isn't about ritual, it's about refusal. You're not here to join a religion, you're here to leave reality. First rule, no sex. Not just outside of marriage. No sex, period. Flesh is illusion. Pleasure reinforces illusion. The body is the prison, and desire is the chain. So if you're serious about escaping this place, you don't indulge it. You don't nurture it. You don't celebrate it. You deny it. Love is fine, but only the eternal kind. The kind that doesn't require touch, or property, or children. Romantic partnerships are for people who plan on reincarnating. You do not. Second rule, no cheese, or meat, or anything that comes from reproduction. Why? Because reproduction binds souls to bodies. Every time you consume something born of flesh, you're reinforcing the cycle. You're participating in the system. So no eggs, no milk, no butter, no honey. You eat plants. Ideally ones that didn't suffer too much when you pulled them from the ground. The Cathars weren't just vegetarians. They were ontological minimalists. The less you consume, the less you owe. The less you touch, the less you cling. Your stomach is not a temple. It's a liability. Third rule, no property. Not just in the share your things sense. Property itself is part of the illusion. Ownership is attachment. Attachment is desire. Desire is the fuel that keeps the wheel of reincarnation turning. So you don't own land. You don't hoard wealth. You don't build monuments. You travel light. You wear black, carry nothing, and rely entirely on the generosity of others. That sounds noble, until winter comes and nobody's generous. Now, this isn't for everyone. In fact, most Cathars weren't full-time ascetics. They lived regular lives and looked up to the perfecti, the spiritual elite who renounced everything. These were the exemplars, the ones who walked the talk, the ones who had taken the consolamentum, the Cathar baptism of spirit, and devoted the rest of their lives to not being here, metaphorically speaking. They preached, healed, fasted, and prepared for death like it was a long-awaited vacation. Everyone else just tried to follow from a distance, quietly, carefully, without getting noticed. Because here's the catch, every one of these rules makes you suspicious. You don't go to mass, you don't eat with your neighbours, you don't marry, you don't conform. And in a world where conformity is safety, that's all it takes to make you a threat. So, congratulations, you've chosen the path of light. Now try not to get set on fire before your soul escapes. At first, it's just whispers. A friar passes through town and asks a few too many questions. A neighbour starts avoiding eye contact. The baker's cousin stops selling to you. Then one morning, someone knocks at your door with a scroll, a seal, and the voice of God's legal department. Congratulations, the Inquisition has arrived. Not the flashy Spanish one that shows up centuries later with hats and pyrotechnics. This is the earlier version, the quieter, colder, more administrative branch. It doesn't need drama, it has parchment, and it has time. The Inquisition was designed to root out heresy, but it doesn't really care about what you believe, not deeply. It's more interested in whether you can be made to break. The goal isn't spiritual dialogue, it's compliance. They're not theologians, they're soul auditors. You sit at a table, you're asked if you know any Cathars, if you've fed them, if you've heard their teachings. If you've failed to report someone who might have nodded during the wrong sermon, say yes, and you're complicit. Say no, and you're lying. It's a perfect system, because the only proof they need is your refusal to admit guilt. Once you're accused, it's your job to prove your innocence. But how do you prove a negative? You can't. You can only submit. So they give you two options. 1. Confess. Give names. Renounce everything. Possibly get away with penance. Maybe even survive. 2. Maintain your innocence and find out how long it takes to scream without biting off your own tongue. They don't call it torture, not officially. They call it examination. But the tools say otherwise. Racks, thumb screws, strappado ropes, long nights in dark rooms, no sleep, no water, no way out. You're not being punished. You're being saved, violently. They tell you it's for your soul. That truth must be extracted like poison. That pain is purifying. You try to hold on. You repeat what you know. The world is an illusion. The flesh is a trap. The light is within. They call it nonsense. Then they dislocate your shoulders. Some people break. Some people fake. Some people die trying to remember why silence mattered so much. And when it's over, if you survive, they mark you. A brand. A burned tunic. Public humiliation. You wear your shame like a uniform. Everyone sees. Everyone knows. The idea is deterrence. But it works more like a sermon. You become a warning. Or a martyr, depending on who's watching. And just to be clear, the Inquisition doesn't stop. It doesn't retire. It doesn't get bored. It records everything. Centuries of reports, names, confessions, screams, meticulously written down, because the church might forget your body, but it will never forget your paperwork. So here you are, bound, bruised, half awake, wondering if this is what enlightenment looks like, and realizing, too late, that knowing the truth is the easy part. Surviving it is another story. Montségur sits high in the Pyrenees, a lonely stone fortress clinging to a cliff like it knows what's coming. The view is spectacular. Lush valleys, sharp winds, sky that goes on forever. But you didn't come here for the scenery. You came here because it's the last place left where truth hasn't been outlawed. Montségur is a Cathar stronghold, but not in the way castles usually work. There are no treasure rooms, no banquets, no knights polishing armour. What you find here are mystics, quiet people in black robes, men and women who've renounced the world and are waiting, not for battle, but for release. The fortress is run by the perfecti, Cathar clergy, who have nothing and want even less. They spend their days preaching, fasting, and preparing others for death, not in a morbid way, but in a practical one. They know the world is a trap. They know the end is coming. They've seen the signs. The villages burned, the whispers growing louder, the armies marching closer, and yet they stay. Because Montségur isn't just a fortress, it's a sanctuary, a final gasp of clarity before the system shuts down. You arrive hungry, scared, and half-broken from the last town that turned you in. But here, you find silence. Not peace, exactly. There's tension in the air, but a kind of spiritual stillness. People here have already let go of safety, of comfort, of illusion. They've taken the consolamentum, they've said goodbye to the world, and now they wait. Not for rescue, but for transcendence. Montségur is not a refuge, it's a launch pad. Still, the church can't let it stand. It's too public, too defiant, too high profile. So in 1243, they send an army. 10 months of siege follow. Cold, hunger, sickness. The Cathars hold out, not with weapons, but with patience. They sing, they pray, they prepare. And when the walls finally fall, they don't beg, they don't bargain. They ask for time, just 2 weeks, to settle affairs, to give the consolamentum to everyone still waiting. The church agrees, possibly confused by the lack of resistance. And when the time is up, 205 people walk out of Montségur and into the flames. No protest, no panic, just resolve. They are offered mercy if they recant. None do, because for the Cathars, this isn't execution, it's escape. The soul finally unchained, the world finally behind them. Fire is just the last illusion to walk through. The fortress is taken, the ashes scatter, and Montségur becomes a story, a ruin on a hill. A place where, for a moment, truth held its ground, not with swords, but with silence. And that silence is still there. If you climb high enough, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. 700 steps. That's how many it takes to climb from the base of Montségur to its summit. 700 uneven stones, winding upward toward a crumbling fortress and an invisible finish line. Pilgrims make the climb in silence. Tourists pant their way up with cameras. But the Cathars who once lived here, they didn't climb to admire the view. They climbed to leave the world behind. Each step was a refusal. Each breath, a protest. Because when you believe the world is a lie, every ascent becomes a declaration. I am not staying. You reach the top. You see the ruined walls. You feel the wind. and if you stand very still, you can almost sense it, the weight of all those last days. In 1244, the fortress finally fell. The 10-month siege ended not with a battle, but with a promise. The Perfecti asked for 2 weeks to prepare. The army, oddly gracious, agreed. And so, in the shadow of their own destruction, the Cathars did something remarkable. They initiated everyone. Dozens of believers who had lived as sympathizers, on the edge of full commitment, stepped forward to take the consolamentum, the Cathar spiritual baptism. The point of no return. It wasn't symbolic. It was everything. Once you took it, there was no going back. No sex, no meat, no property, no future in this world. You were now spiritually bound to escape, and you had maybe 14 days to do it. When the deadline came, the gates opened. No fight, no panic, just a procession. 205 souls walked down from the fortress and into the valley. The church had built a large wooden pyre, efficient, public, sufficiently dramatic. The crowd watched. The officials asked if anyone would recant. Nobody moved, and so they were led to the fire. Men, women, elders. Some were barely old enough to have tasted adulthood. They went calmly. The records say so. Not a mob, not a frenzy, just a quiet march toward purification. To the church, it was justice. To the Cathars, it was liberation. The fire wasn't punishment, it was passage. Their bodies burned, but they didn't see the body as sacred. It was just the last costume to remove, the last lock on the cage. Today there's no pyre, just grass, stones, tourists with backpacks and trail mix. But if you know where to look, there's a monument. Simple, a slab of rock honouring those who chose to walk into the flames rather than bow to illusion. No names, just the memory, just the echo of that final truth, that sometimes salvation looks like a step forward into fire. So yes, 700 steps to reach the fortress, and just a few more to leave the world behind. Some people call it suicide, others call it faith. The Cathars called it freedom. You're summoned. No explanation, no accusation. Just a polite notice that your presence is requested for questioning. It's never really a request. It's the beginning of something. You don't know what yet, but you can guess. Maybe someone said your prayers sounded odd. Maybe your neighbour mentioned you don't eat meat. Maybe a friar saw you speaking with someone in black robes. Or maybe no one said anything at all, and the church just needs another name to scratch off a very long list. The Inquisition doesn't look like a battlefield. It looks like a desk, a quill, and a man who smiles without blinking. He asks if you know the Cathars, if you've spoken with them, if you've attended their secret meetings, if you've heard their teachings. He phrases it like a chat, a formality. But you know better. He already thinks you're guilty. He just needs you to cooperate with your own undoing. At first, you deny it. Of course you do. You're not suicidal. You say you're loyal to the church. You say you've never met a perfectus. You say you're innocent. The Inquisitor nods, writes something down, and then calmly asks the guards to escort you to a different room, a darker one. The questions continue, but now your wrists are tied behind your back. Now there's something sharp nearby, something heavy, something boiling. The rules say torture should be used sparingly. The rules say it must never be lethal. The rules say it's only to assist memory. But here's the secret. The rules are also written by the Inquisitors, and memory, conveniently, means whatever they want it to. So they stretch you until your joints scream. They press you underwater until your body begs to breathe. They squeeze your fingers until they break. And when you finally cry out, when your mouth opens and something vaguely heretical spills out, they call it a confession. Then they write it down. Then they tell you God is pleased. It's not about the truth. It's about submission. They want to see you bend, not because they care what you think, but because control must be demonstrated. They don't need your soul. They need your fear. And if the body must suffer for that to happen, so be it. Pain, after all, is cleansing. Some people give names, some people recant, some people die before they say anything. It doesn't matter. The church gets what it wants, obedience or ash, and both are useful. You'll be released eventually, maybe, with broken hands, shattered sleep, and a robe marked so everyone knows what you are. You'll walk home differently, speak less, eat carefully. People will avoid you, or worse, watch you more closely, and you'll never know which answer started all this. But deep down, you'll remember the one rule you broke, the one crime you committed. You knew something you weren't supposed to. They wear black, always black. Not because it's fashionable, but because it's humble. It doesn't catch the eye, doesn't signal status, doesn't shimmer with vanity. The perfecti, Cathar spiritual leaders, don't want attention, they want release. And attention, like desire, like property, like comfort, is just another rope tying the soul to the dream. So they walk softly, they speak gently, they fast often, they smile rarely. Their job isn't to lead people toward power, it's to guide them out of illusion quietly, before someone notices. The perfecti are at the center of Cathar spirituality, but they don't call themselves priests. That would imply hierarchy, structure, authority. They don't bless marriages because they don't believe in marriage. They don't baptize with water because they don't believe in physical cleansing. They don't perform sacraments because to them sacraments are just holy branding exercises. Instead, they offer one rite, the consolamentum, a spiritual baptism, a laying on of hands. A single act that turns a believer into a person who is no longer invested in staying here. Once a person receives it, they are expected to live like the perfecti. No sex, no meat, no lies, no possessions. Ideally, they do this for years. Realistically, most people waited until they were dying. It was safer that way. You could spend your life navigating the world's nonsense, then take the consolamentum on your deathbed and skip the whole reincarnation loop. A clever workaround. But the perfecti, they didn't wait. They took the vow early and kept it. Every day was a practice of non-existence. They didn't live in monasteries. They walked from village to village. Quiet, lean figures passing through the world like it was already over. They relied on hospitality. They offered teaching, healing, prayer. Not sermons, conversations, not commands, gentle reminders. You'd invite them in, offer them food, which they might not eat, and listen. And for a moment, something made sense. The ache you'd been carrying wasn't sin. It was homesickness. And the perfectus didn't try to fix it. He just nodded, because he felt it too. The church hated them. Not because they were violent, they weren't, but because they undermined everything. They didn't argue. They didn't protest. They just lived in a way that made the whole world look suspicious. They didn't marry. They didn't tithe. They didn't kneel at the altar. And somehow, they were peaceful, kind, serene. It was embarrassing. The church tried to paint them as evil, but it didn't stick. Evil is loud. Evil is obvious. The perfecti were calm, and that made them worse. They weren't fighting the church. They were outgrowing it. So the church hunted them, questioned villagers, tortured sympathizers, promised mercy in exchange for names. And still the perfecti walked, thin and tired and inconveniently holy, just trying not to exist too loudly. But truth, once embodied, is hard to ignore. Even when it whispers. The trouble with the Cathars isn't that they're violent, they're not. They don't riot, don't revolt, don't raise armies or burn cities. The problem is subtler, quieter, more inconvenient. The Cathars aren't afraid of death, and that makes them impossible to control. You can't threaten someone with a fate they already accept. You can't bribe someone who doesn't want anything, and you can't silence someone who doesn't fear the consequences of speaking. The Cathars don't play by the rules of the world. That's the problem. They've stopped believing the game is real. In the Cathar worldview, death is just a door. Not an ending, not a punishment, just a final shift from illusion to light. If you've taken the consolamentum and lived accordingly, death is even desirable. The body, after all, is a prison. The soul isn't supposed to be here. The material world is a cage built by the demiurge, and death is one of the few keys that still works. So while most people cling to life like it's a fragile blessing, the Cathars let go, not because they're morbid, but because they're done pretending it's paradise. This makes them dangerous, not to the soul, but to authority, because if you're not afraid of dying, no one can force you to kneel. You won't recant just to save your skin. You won't betray others to buy time. You won't lie to keep breathing. And in a world run by people who depend on fear to maintain order, that's deeply inconvenient. The church needs people terrified of hell, desperate for mercy, willing to submit. But the Cathars already believe the world is hell, and mercy? They believe it comes from knowledge, not obedience. So when the church threatens them, they don't flinch. When inquisitors offer deals, they decline. When flames are lit beneath the stake, they walk forward. Not because they want to die, but because they understand something the church refuses to admit, that fear is the real trap, and escaping fear is the first step to escaping the simulation. That's what made Montségur so unsettling. 200 souls walked into fire without panic, without protest, just quiet, peaceful resolve. It wasn't martyrdom for them, it was graduation. The church meant it to be a warning, but it became a sermon, one the church couldn't refute without admitting that something about it looked real. So the message spread, not loudly, not in public squares, but in whispers, in glances, in shared bread and quiet evenings. People saw the Cathars face death and thought, what do they know that I don't? And maybe, just maybe, they began to wonder if the world really was as sacred as they'd been told. The Cathars didn't fear death, and that terrified everyone else, because if death isn't the worst thing, then maybe the system built to prevent it isn't salvation. Maybe it's the prison. It's a strange kind of threat, the kind that doesn't carry a weapon, own any land, or want anything you have. The perfecti had no palaces, no soldiers, no political agenda. They wandered barefoot, carrying only the clothes on their backs and a quiet conviction that the entire world was a lie. And somehow, that made them dangerous. Because it turns out the most subversive person in a corrupt system is the one who no longer needs it. A man who won't take your money, bow to your titles, or be tempted by your pleasures is impossible to bargain with, and impossible to control. That's the part the church couldn't stand. It wasn't the Cathars' refusal to attend Mass, or their rejection of the sacraments. It wasn't even the doctrine, although the material world is evil isn't exactly a PR-friendly slogan. No, the real problem was that the perfecti lived as if it were true. They didn't just preach detachment, they practiced it, and in doing so, they exposed everyone else. Priests with fine robes, bishops in marble halls, nobles clutching crucifixes in one hand and wine goblets in the other, all of them suddenly looked absurd next to a gaunt figure who asked for nothing and gave peace in return. That kind of living can't be taxed, it can't be drafted into wars. It doesn't feed the economy, doesn't buy indulgences, doesn't fight for kings. It quietly removes itself from the entire machine, and that's why the machine turns on it, because people started to notice. Farmers, merchants, widows, they listened. They saw the perfecti refuse power and wondered if maybe they could too, if maybe wealth wasn't holiness, if maybe salvation didn't come from obeying men in robes but from waking up to something deeper. And when too many people start asking those questions, the system has two options: adapt or eliminate. Guess which one it chose. So inquisitors came, armies followed, towns were searched, names were taken, those with too little, those who gave too much, those who fasted a little too long or didn't look frightened enough at the sight of a bishop, all were watched. Being good wasn't enough. Being pure was actually worse. You had to be visibly invested in the world. Otherwise, you were suspect. And the perfecti kept walking. Not as heroes, not as rebels, just as people who had already given up everything and therefore had nothing left to lose. The church called them heretics, but their lives made it clear. If this world is so sacred, why is it run on fear? In the end, the Cathars didn't try to overthrow anything. They didn't need to. They were already living as if it had all collapsed. And in that quiet refusal to participate, they created a crisis. Because holy men with nothing still held something no one else could fake. Freedom. You don't need to be a theologian to feel it. That faint tug of unease when you wake up and stare at your ceiling, wondering why everything feels slightly off. You walk through a crowded city surrounded by light and noise and movement, and yet somehow it all seems staged. You scroll through news, ads, headlines, smiling faces, and somewhere deep in your gut, something mutters, "This isn't it." That quiet voice. The Cathars would have called it memory, not memory of this life, but of a place before it. A place without rot, without time, without hunger, the real world, the one you forgot. Modern life calls it anxiety, spiritual confusion, dissociation. But the Cathars had a simpler word, illusion. They believed the world was built by a being pretending to be God. Not evil, exactly, just misguided, desperate for worship, drunk on authority and tragically creative. He stitched together matter, time and decay into a prison so convincing most of us forgot it was a prison at all. And we've spent our lives adapting, buying things to feel real, working to feel valuable, struggling to stay alive in a realm designed to distract. But some people don't adapt. They feel the glitch, the slippage, the unreality in everything. They say things like, "Why does joy vanish so fast?" Or, "Why do beautiful things decay?" Or worse, "Why do I feel like I'm meant to be somewhere else?" That's not rebellion, that's recognition. And if you'd asked a perfectus, he wouldn't have argued with you. He would have nodded quietly and said something like, "You're beginning to remember." The Cathars didn't need science to tell them the world was unstable. They didn't need therapy to explain existential dread. They knew that aching feeling in your chest wasn't a mental illness. It was homesickness. Your soul came from a realm that doesn't break. A place beyond opposites. No light or dark. No up or down. No pain or ecstasy. Just being. Pure, silent, endless being. Compared to that, this place feels loud, clumsy, and slightly absurd, like someone made a copy of heaven with a broken pen. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start questioning things that everyone else treats as obvious. Why does power always demand obedience? Why does suffering seem baked into the system? Why are you punished for asking questions that make people uncomfortable? That discomfort you feel when the world doesn't line up with your soul, that's your map. Follow it. You don't have to wear robes or renounce cheese to be a Cathar, you just have to notice the simulation and then refuse to worship it. So next time you feel that twinge, that strange, aching sense that everything around you is slightly misaligned, don't ignore it. That's not confusion. That's your soul remembering. And somewhere, in the ashes of Montségur, a perfectus is still nodding. The region of Languedoc wasn't supposed to be the centre of a spiritual apocalypse. It was supposed to be pleasant. Rolling hills, mild winters, good wine, a place where troubadours sang and peasants worked and no one asked too many questions. But questions happened anyway, big ones, about life, death, truth, and who exactly gets to speak for God. And those questions, left unanswered, turned Languedoc into a theological minefield. The Cathars flourished here, not because they were aggressive, but because they were coherent. Their message made sense in a world that no longer did, and that was enough to summon the end. Not the end of the world, just the end of illusion. And for institutions built on illusion, that's worse. It didn't start with fire, it started with influence. Cathars were everywhere, nobles, artisans, even clergy, who quietly agreed but didn't say it out loud. They weren't hiding in caves, they were in castles, in conversations, in confessions too honest to survive inspection. And that made Languedoc a problem. It wasn't just a few fanatics anymore, it was a cultural shift, a mass quiet refusal to believe the world was what the church insisted it was. The Pope responded with diplomacy, then with threats, then with crusade. Because when hearts and minds are slipping away, swords are the last persuasive tool. So the armies came, crusaders from the north who didn't speak the language, didn't know the terrain, and didn't care who they were killing, because they'd been told this was holy work, that the people in Languedoc weren't just heretics. They were worse. They were unclean. The apocalypse wasn't sudden. It was bureaucratic, city by city, village by village, each one investigated, judged, and corrected. Some were given a chance to repent, others were simply destroyed. Béziers became infamous. When the town refused to hand over its heretics, it was sacked completely. "Kill them all," the papal legate reportedly said. "God will know his own." That wasn't a metaphor. That was strategy. People fled, or tried to. Others stayed, unsure which answer would get them killed slower. The Inquisition followed close behind, like a mop dragging behind a wave. Lists were made, doors knocked, questions asked, answers punished. And Languedoc, once a haven of pluralism and awkwardly shared belief systems, became a graveyard of unspoken convictions. The Cathars didn't fight back. Not really. Some resisted, some hiding. Some whispered until they couldn't whisper anymore, but most didn't see a point in fighting. This wasn't a war of territory. It was a war on truth. And truth, once you've seen it, isn't something you defend with a blade. You just carry it, even as the world burns down around you. So Languedoc ended. Slowly, painfully, deliberately. Not with a bang, but with a doctrine. And through it all, the Cathars kept walking, kept singing, kept dying, as if the world wasn't ending at all. Because for them, it never really began. The Cathars had no army, no cathedrals, no catacombs full of relics or gold-threaded vestments. What they had was an idea, one simple, disorienting, stubborn idea, that this world was not made by God. And it turns out, if you repeat that idea quietly enough, for long enough, people start listening. Not because they're angry, but because something inside them is already suspicious. And suddenly, the cathedral feels cold. The liturgy sounds hollow. The world feels off. You didn't invent doubt. You just named it. The church noticed and responded the only way it knew how, by assuming that if an idea won't die, maybe burning enough bodies will do the trick. For the next century, that was the plan. If someone was caught with Cathar beliefs, they were interrogated, tortured, and, if sufficiently uncooperative, set on fire in the name of spiritual hygiene. Bonfires became sacraments, ashes, evidence of divine justice. And still, the idea spread, not in grand speeches, not in scrolls or tomes, in whispers, in small gatherings, in back rooms and quiet fields. Someone would say, "Have you ever thought maybe this world isn't how it's supposed to be?" And someone else would nod. You couldn't kill that. Because the Cathar idea wasn't just theological, it was intuitive. It explained why suffering seemed endless, why beauty was fragile, why power always felt like theft wrapped in gold. The more they were hunted, the more they were remembered. Martyrs don't need monuments, they just need stories, and the church, by trying to erase them, wrote those stories louder than the Cathars ever could. Every trial transcript, every interrogation, every name inscribed in the margins of inquisitorial records became an unintentional archive of resistance. The church preserved what it meant to silence. And still, the executions continued. Carcassonne, Toulouse, Lavore, cities that echoed with cries, then fell back into silence. The church would declare a region cleansed, only to find that somewhere, in some farmhouse, an old woman was teaching her grandchildren about the illusion of matter, that a traveller had walked into a town with no belongings and no fear, that someone, again, had stopped pretending the world was holy. 100 years of pressure, of fire, of surveillance and suspicion. 100 years of trying to convince people that obedience was salvation and that truth only lived in Rome. And yet, somehow, the Cathar flame flickered on. Because it never burned in buildings or books, it burned in people. In anyone who ever looked at a church and felt nothing, at a crown and felt disgust, at the world and felt like they were only visiting. Ideas like that don't die. They go quiet. They go underground. They become legend. But they wait, because you can burn every scroll. You can erase every name. You can salt the earth. But you can't destroy a question once it's been asked. The Cathars didn't believe in hell, not the way the church described it. No lakes of fire, no devils with pitchforks, no eternal scream pits for sinners who forgot to tithe. No, the Cathars had a much simpler and somehow more disturbing version of punishment, reincarnation. Not as reward, as prison sentence. You don't get judged, weighed, and placed somewhere eternal. You just get sent back, here, over and over again, into this same broken world, a loop, a trap, a system with no exit unless you figure it out. So if you die with unresolved desire, back you go. If you die full of anger, back again. Still clinging to property, status, flesh. spin the wheel, try again. You could come back as a peasant, a merchant, a donkey, a worm. Maybe you'd be lucky. Maybe you'd be born into comfort. But comfort is the most dangerous illusion of all, because it makes you forget you're still stuck. It makes the prison look like a palace. That's what the Cathars were trying to escape. Not hell in the next world, but hell disguised as ordinary life. The endless repetition of pain, longing, forgetting. And the only way out? Absolute detachment. Release everything. No anger, no sex, no possessions, no lies. You strip yourself down until there's nothing left for the wheel to grab onto. And if you do it well enough, your soul simply leaves. Not to paradise, not to sit on clouds and sing hymns, but to a realm beyond opposites, beyond flesh, beyond illusion. Of course, that sounds insane to most people. Reincarnation was a foreign idea in medieval Europe, and the church wasn't fond of any theology it couldn't monetize. The idea that salvation required neither priest, nor building, nor sacrament, that was heresy of the worst kind, especially when it came with a built-in rejection of fear. The Cathars weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of staying. So when someone took the consolamentum, the Cathar spiritual baptism, they weren't joining a club. They were committing to escape. They were saying, I'm done with this. And they meant all of it. The hunger, the violence, the endless performance of normal life. Some of them fasted to death to ensure they didn't backslide. Not because they hated the body, but because they'd stopped confusing it with self. To the church, this was nihilism. To the Cathars, it was the only truth worth living for. So yes, welcome to the afterlife. It looks exactly like the life you just left. Same warlords, same poverty, same grind. Because unless you wake up and really let go, you don't go anywhere. You just start over, again and again. The bad news? You've probably been here a while. The good news? There's still time to remember what you are. And it's not this. The Cathars had a radical idea. Not just that the world was broken, but that it was built broken. On purpose. And the one who built it. Not God. Not the real one, anyway. They believed the true God was pure spirit, completely separate from the material world, silent, unseen, beyond form, light, suffering, even thought. But what we call God, the one who made trees, time, teeth, disease, money, and monarchy, that, they said, was a fraud, a power-hungry imposter, a being who mistook creation for control and tricked everyone into believing he was the Most High. The Cathars didn't invent this idea. It came from earlier Gnostic currents, drifting through Syria, Egypt, and Persia, long before Europe took notice. The being in question was often called the demiurge, from the Greek for craftsman. Not evil in a cartoonish, moustache-twirling way, just wrong, flawed, confused. He thought he was the only one, and out of that divine delusion came everything. Gravity, hunger, aging, kingdoms, dust. The world was his art project, and you're stuck inside the frame. To most Christians, this was offensive. God doesn't make mistakes. God is love. God made puppies. But the Cathars weren't charmed. They looked around and saw a world teeming with violence, greed, and decay. If this is divine design, they thought, maybe we should get a second opinion, and so they did. They split creation in two. Spirit, good. Matter, bad. The world isn't sacred, it's a trap. Don't worship it. Don't get attached. Don't build your identity out of things that can rot. This wasn't pessimism, it was clarity. Because once you accept that the creator of matter isn't the final authority, a lot of things suddenly make sense. Why pleasure fades, why power corrupts, why the more you chase fulfillment, the more you feel empty. You're trying to find spiritual truth in a physical labyrinth designed by something that doesn't know the exit, or worse, doesn't want you to find it. The demiurge loves control. Rules, systems, thrones, temples. He loves when you pray to him, obey him, give him offerings. He loves being the center of your fear. And the Cathars simply said, no thanks. They believed the true God didn't want sacrifice. He wanted remembrance. The moment you remembered what you really were, light, breath, soul, the illusion would begin to break. And the world, along with its architect, would lose its grip. This belief cost the Cathars everything. Their homes, their freedom, their lives, but they didn't flinch. Because once you know you're being held hostage by a jealous minor deity, obedience starts to look a lot like surrender. So if things feel wrong, if life tastes like imitation, if peace always seems one step out of reach, it might not be your fault. It might be the blueprint. And if that's true, the goal isn't to fix the world, it's to wake up and walk out of it. The Cathars had an unpopular opinion about love. Not that it was sinful, not that it was shameful, just that it was dangerous. Because in their world, love wasn't red roses and handwritten notes. It was one of the stickiest nets the illusion could throw at you. Romantic love, parental love, even friendship. All of it, they believed, had the potential to bind the soul more tightly to the material world. Not because people are bad, but because attachment, even the tender, soul-warming kind, keeps you here. And here is the whole problem. They didn't hate people. They just didn't trust the strings. You love someone deeply, and suddenly your thoughts are about meals, beds, futures. You worry. You cling. You make promises to stay in a place you were meant to transcend. That's what scared the Cathars. Not intimacy, but entanglement. The way love, so often, slides into fear. Fear of loss, fear of being alone, fear of change. And fear, they knew, is the anchor that keeps the soul from lifting. So the perfecti lived without it, not because they were cold, but because they wanted freedom more. They practiced detachment, not cruelty. They helped others, they comforted, they taught, but they didn't marry. They didn't have children. They didn't build families, because to them, every relationship had the potential to become another spiritual mortgage, something you owed, something you couldn't leave, something that made you say, maybe just one more lifetime. It sounds bleak. But then again, look at the world. Look at how much suffering comes wrapped in the language of love. I did this because I care. I stayed because I couldn't hurt them. I gave up everything for him. You fall in love and suddenly your soul is bartering with the system again. You think you're free, but you've just built a prettier cage. One with matching outfits and couples' rings. And yet, you try anyway. You meet someone. They're broken, obviously, but beautiful. And something in you whispers, I can fix him. Not with tools, not with logic, but with love. And just like that, you forget. The illusion smiles. The trap resets. And the Cathars sigh softly from the other side of memory. This isn't a warning against love. It's a reminder that love in this world often comes with chains. That attachment isn't the same as connection. That devotion can quietly become possession. And that what feels eternal might just be another loop. So yes, you tried, you believed, you loved. Maybe it was beautiful, maybe it burned, maybe you're still standing in the ruins holding a handful of promises you can't return. And still, the Cathars don't judge you. They just nod, gently, and say, you'll get it next time. You're on a journey. Or at least that's what the algorithm told you. You're seeking truth, healing, transcendence, whatever word feels important this month. You've read the books, you've done the meditations, you've bought the ethically sourced Himalayan salt lamp that promised to rebalance your aura, and somewhere in your search you found a guide, someone gentle-eyed with a warm voice and a background in vaguely Eastern philosophy. They said all the right things, that you are enough, that everything is energy, and that freedom can be yours for just 3 easy payments of $129.99. The Cathars would be unimpressed. Not because modern spirituality is different from theirs, but because it's eerily similar and somehow worse. The same desire to escape suffering, the same suspicion that the world is fake, the same ache for something higher. But unlike the Cathars, modern spiritual influences tend to stop at the merchandise shelf. Enlightenment has become a brand. Your trauma is a market. Your longing is a niche. They sell you crystals and call it healing. They write ebooks on how to raise your vibration and sell guided past life regressions on Etsy. None of it's evil exactly, but all of it distracts you from the real work. Letting go. Not just of pain, but of identity, comfort, and the ego that insists you're just one more cacao ceremony away from cosmic bliss. The Cathars didn't want your money. They didn't want your admiration. They didn't promise to fix your life. They promised to help you leave it. Gently, quietly, through fasting, honesty, and the slow detachment from all the shiny, clever distractions the world throws at you. They weren't charismatic, they weren't building followings, they were dismantling selves. So when someone offers you the shortcut, the glow-up, the transformation in 12 steps, the Cathars would remind you, the truth doesn't sparkle, it doesn't smell like sandalwood, and it definitely doesn't require a Patreon subscription. Real spiritual practice feels more like subtraction than addition. It strips away the illusions, the narratives, the parts of you that love to be admired. It leaves you empty, not in a sad way, but in a clean way, like finally dropping a mask you didn't know you were wearing. So be careful. Not of darkness, but of comfort dressed as wisdom. Of gurus with product lines. Of seekers who never seem to arrive because arriving would mean the shop closes. Spirituality doesn't need accessories. Just attention. Just quiet. Just the willingness to walk away from everything that flatters you. Even your favourite guide, especially your favourite guide, because if he's offering truth but also sells branded candles, he might be more invested in your incense budget than your liberation. Picture it, a Cathar perfectus in a minimalist stone room, dim candlelight, sitting cross-legged in their black robe. The thumbnail reads, "Escaping the Illusion, 3 Ways to Detach from the Material World." The intro music plays. Then the perfectus smiles into the camera and says, "Hey guys, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for weekly spiritual truths about escaping your cursed flesh prison." Impossible. The Cathars didn't do branding. They didn't do performance. They barely did conversation. Their whole spiritual model was about dissolving the self, not amplifying it. To be a perfectus was to disappear, not go viral. You weren't supposed to accumulate followers. You were supposed to shed ego like dead skin. Any form of self-promotion, even subtle, even cloaked in humble service, was a spiritual red flag. If the message made you look good, you'd already failed. That's why they would have hated modern spirituality's flirtation with celebrity. The thirst trap yogis, the curated mystics, the podcast prophets with mic setups more expensive than their sacred texts. Today's online spiritual space turns enlightenment into a career path. But to the Cathars, salvation meant vanishing, not metaphorically, fully. No more ambition, no more identity, no more journey as content, and certainly no monetized ad breaks between steps on the spiritual ladder. You can't detach from the illusion while chasing engagement metrics. You can't upload non-attachment. Every frame centers the self, even the silent ones. Even the ones that say, "This isn't about me," while sitting under professional lighting and wearing $200 ethically sourced hemp robes. Even sincerity starts to look like performance if you're being filmed for it. And for the Cathars, the performance was the prison. This is why they walked, not preached. Why they didn't write books or argue theology in public forums. Their lives were the message. You either noticed or you didn't. And if you did, they didn't ask for a testimonial. They invited you to let go too, quietly, privately, without fanfare, without applause, certainly without a comment section. Which isn't to say the Cathars were inaccessible. They answered questions. They comforted the dying. They held space for people who were lost. But they never made themselves the center. They didn't aspire to be seen. And that's exactly why people listened. Because in a world addicted to visibility, there's something radical about someone who wants nothing from you. No conversion, no donation, no subscription, just the truth and the silence that comes after. So no, they wouldn't have had a YouTube channel, not even a subtle one, not even for educational purposes. They would have walked right past the camera, barefoot, quiet, inconveniently free. And you'd be left staring at the screen, wondering why the most honest people always seem to be going the other way. Let's be clear, setting someone on fire is generally frowned upon. Even in medieval Europe, where public executions doubled as community events, burning someone alive wasn't the go-to punishment. It was special, reserved, not for murderers or thieves, but for heretics, people who believed the wrong thing too quietly for too long. And when the church burned someone, it wasn't framed as violence, it was mercy, brutal, holy mercy. The logic went like this: better for your body to suffer briefly than for your soul to suffer forever. The Cathars got the worst of it, because they weren't loud, they weren't violent, They were just persistently, uncomfortably serene about their completely incorrect theology. They lived simply, spoke softly, and held a version of the universe that made the church look like the villain, which, of course, made them dangerous. Not because they rebelled, but because they made obedience look absurd. So the church needed a show of force, not a war, a purification. And fire, that was the most sacred detergent available. They'd gather the accused, sometimes individuals, sometimes hundreds at a time, bind them, march them to the stake, and light the pyres. Sometimes there were speeches, sometimes hymns, sometimes just the crackle of wood and the silent conviction that God would sort out the ashes. And this was considered moral, necessary, because it wasn't just about punishment, it was about demonstration. Heresy spreads quietly, like mold. Fire, on the other hand, is very loud. It doesn't just kill the body, it warns the living. And if you happen to snuff out a few innocent souls in the process, well, better to burn one faithful sheep than let a whole flock wander. To the Cathars, of course, it didn't work. They didn't fear death. They feared staying here. So when the flames came, they walked into them calmly, sometimes singing, sometimes praying, sometimes completely silent. And that silence, that composure, it terrified the church more than any rebellion could, because you can't control someone who isn't trying to survive. The crowds would watch, some wept, some cheered, most just watched, and afterward they went home, cooked dinner, kissed their children, and tried very hard not to think about what they'd just seen. The sky didn't crack open. God didn't send applause. Just another sunset over a town where fewer questions would be asked tomorrow. The church wrote down names, kept records, preserved the confessions pulled from broken bodies. But they never really understood the Cathars. Because once you've convinced yourself that burning someone is an act of love, you've already lost the argument, and the soul you think you're saving, it probably left the fire long before the smoke ever reached heaven. The church could handle a lunatic. It could handle the loud ones, the frothing preachers with apocalyptic timelines, the wild-eyed prophets raving in the streets. Those kinds of heretics were easy to discredit. They burned out on their own, or gave the inquisitors an excuse to lock them up before anyone paid attention. But the Cathars, they weren't loud, they weren't chaotic. They were infuriatingly calm, reasonable, gentle, and worst of all, people liked them. That was the real threat. They weren't trying to start a rebellion. They weren't promising miracles. They just sat in people's homes, asked quiet questions, and told stories that made the world make a little more sense. They helped the sick. They comforted the grieving. They didn't ask for money, didn't dress in luxury, didn't demand obedience. And that kind of holiness, the non-performative, practical, painfully sincere kind, spread faster than doctrine, especially in a world where the official church looked more like a monarchy than a ministry. The average peasant didn't read theology. They didn't care about ecumenical councils or Latin disputes about the nature of the Trinity. But they did notice that the Cathar perfectus showed up during famine, while the bishop was counting taxes, that the Cathar didn't own land or livestock, and yet somehow always had something to give. And when people noticed, they started wondering, what if these heretics aren't wrong? What if they're just honest? That kind of popularity couldn't be ignored. So the church doubled down. The Inquisition sharpened its tools, both metaphorical and literal. Preachers were sent to correct the population, often with soldiers. Public debates were staged, where the Cathars were supposed to be humiliated, but frequently came off looking like the only adults in the room. Still, the church had one advantage the Cathars didn't: enforcement. So if winning hearts failed, fear would have to do. And yet, the affection lingered. Whole towns protected Cathar preachers, nobles refused to hand them over, families hid them in barns and cellars long after the threat of torture became routine. Because once someone has treated your suffering with kindness, real, quiet kindness, it's hard to believe they deserve to burn. So yes, the Cathars were a theological threat, but more dangerously, they were a social one. They disrupted the narrative. If they could live without greed, without coercion, without fear, maybe everyone else could too. And for institutions built on power, that possibility was unacceptable. A sword can silence a rebel, a fire can destroy a heretic. But how do you kill an example? That's the dilemma. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting from the pulpit. It's the one everyone else keeps glancing at, wondering quietly how they got so free. The Cathars are gone. Their leaders burned. Their towns purged. Their records mostly erased or twisted into cautionary tales. The last known perfectus died in the early 14th century, alone, probably hunted. Their movement was declared officially extinguished. Heresy contained. Doctrine restored. Crisis over. But if you listen closely, beyond the ash, beyond the silence the church worked so hard to install, something's still moving. Not people, not sects, just a question. Still walking. It's the question they never managed to burn. What if the world isn't supposed to be like this? It shows up in strange places, on long commutes, in sleepless nights, in the middle of a promotion you work so hard for that suddenly feels hollow. It sneaks into your mind when you're surrounded by all the things you thought would make you happy, and none of them do. That quiet hum beneath the surface of modern life, the one that asks, is this all there is? That's the ghost of Catharism. Not the doctrine, not the fasting or reincarnation charts, just the idea that something here feels off, that maybe suffering isn't random but structural, that maybe it's not your job to adapt to a system that feeds on exhaustion and rewards conformity. Maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe the design is flawed. That's not depression. That's not rebellion. That's recognition. You won't find the Cathars on TikTok. They're not trending. They're not getting rebranded by lifestyle influencers as spiritual minimalists. They didn't survive in name. They survived in feeling, in the ache you can't quite name, in the suspicion that maybe your soul remembers a world that didn't rot. The church won the war. It built the archives. It built the cities. It owns the history. But even after centuries of dominance, it still can't answer that question with anything other than fear. Obey, confess, submit, anything but examine, because to examine the structure means admitting it might not be sacred after all. And the Cathars, they never demanded anything from you. They just noticed the fracture and walked. So yes, the heretics are dead, but you're still here, still walking through a world that looks increasingly artificial, still smiling through systems that promise peace and deliver burnout, still hearing that whisper when everything goes quiet. None of this feels right. And the whisper doesn't care if you believe in dualism or not. It just wants you to pay attention, because maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just remembering, and maybe, just maybe, the fire that tried to silence the truth ended up making it easier to see in the dark. There's always been this strange tension in religion, the claim that God is love, paired with the very human habit of killing in his name. The Cathars noticed it early, the contradiction, the dissonance, how sermons about mercy were delivered with armoured escorts, how crosses were stitched onto war banners, how men could preach humility from pulpits built with blood money. It didn't add up, and the Cathars, unlike most, refused to pretend it did. They didn't think violence was sometimes necessary. They thought it was always a mistake, not just morally, but cosmically. If the divine is truly perfect, it doesn't need coercion. If God is truly all-powerful, he doesn't need armed men to defend his reputation. And if a religion can't survive without swords, stakes, and silence, maybe it isn't serving God at all. That's why the Cathars saw the church not as misguided, but as a product of a different source entirely. Not the God of light, peace, and truth, but the lesser creator, the one who built the world from ego, from power, from force, the one who says, "Obey me or burn." The Cathars looked at that threat and said, "No thank you." Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity, because they'd already seen behind the curtain, and they knew that truth doesn't demand blood. So when the Crusades came, when the swords were drawn and the pyres were built, the Cathars didn't fight. Not because they were cowards, because they didn't believe salvation could be defended with steel. You can't purify a soul with a blade. You can only mutilate a body, and mutilating the body, they said, never brings anyone closer to God. Still, the church marched on. It called itself holy while acting like a state, and the Cathars kept pointing at the contradiction, calmly, like someone noticing a fire the rest of the room pretended wasn't there. That's what made them unbearable, not their theology, their refusal to panic. It would have been easier if they'd rebelled, if they'd taken up arms and validated the church's fear. But they didn't. They just kept living as if violence was beneath them, as if the truth didn't need a sword at all. And that's the part the church couldn't tolerate, because power only knows how to speak in force. And when someone responds with stillness, it feels like defiance, even when it's just truth refusing to be dramatized. So the next time someone says they're defending God by silencing others, punishing doubt, or wielding fear, ask yourself, what kind of God needs that? And then remember, the Cathars didn't win, but they never picked up the sword, because they knew something we've almost forgotten. Real divinity doesn't require protection, it requires nothing. You've probably had the feeling, the quiet urge to shut it all down, to walk out of the job, toss your phone in a river, leave the city, forget your name, to stop pretending any of this makes sense. And of course, you talked yourself out of it. You said it was burnout. You blamed your hormones. You called it escapism. But the Cathars might have looked at you, eyes calm, and said, "Ah, you're starting to remember." In their eyes, that feeling wasn't dysfunction. It was revelation. A flash of clarity in a fogged-up world. Because the life you've been trained to live, work, buy, conform, impress, was, to them, the problem. Not just morally, cosmologically. They believed this entire system was designed by a confused spiritual contractor who mistook control for creation. Every institution that demands your energy, every performance you're forced to give, every soul-splintering compromise you make to survive, those aren't signs of a broken society. They're features of the trap. So when you feel the pull to leave, to detach, to reject, to disappear, it might not be madness. It might be a form of spiritual literacy, your soul whispering that it's time to stop pretending this cage is a cathedral. Now, to be clear, the Cathars weren't anarchists. They weren't promoting chaos or selfish abandon. They weren't saying, run away from responsibility. They were saying, notice what's real. And if something in your life only exists because you're afraid to lose it, it was never yours. Your job title, your wardrobe, your curated online persona, your 5-year plan, all of it might just be debris floating in a dream. Quitting, for them, wasn't about despair. It was about precision. What can I release? What do I actually need? What can I live without and still remain whole? And once you start asking those questions, you'll find the list of essentials shrinking fast. The Cathars didn't think you had to shave your head and live in a cave. They just believed you had to stop worshipping the game. And if quitting your job, or deleting your socials, or choosing silence over spectacle gets you closer to that, then yes, leave, walk, let go. You're not a failure, you're just recalibrating. In a world that teaches you to acquire, quitting is the most radical form of remembering. So next time that urge bubbles up, that craving to vanish, to simplify, to stop performing, don't dismiss it too quickly. Sit with it, listen, trace it back. You might find it's not escapism at all. It's your soul trying to speak. And somewhere, in the quiet between illusions, a Cathar is nodding. According to the Cathars, the devil doesn't show up with horns and a flaming pitchfork. He doesn't need to. He already owns the building. He's the landlord, the contractor, the architect of the whole visible world. You're not in his trap because you broke a rule or made a bad choice. You're in it because you were born here, into a structure that was never built for your freedom. No tricks, no surprises. Just a lease you didn't know you signed, binding you to a reality that keeps charging interest on your own soul. This world, full of hunger, decay, violence, vanity, it's not broken, according to Cathar logic. It's functioning exactly as intended. It's a distraction machine, a karmic treadmill, a spiritual mortgage you pay with your attention, your hope, and eventually your bones. And the devil, he's not laughing in a pit somewhere. He's working reception, smiling, offering you a loyalty card. Welcome to the world, he says. Everything is yours, as long as you stay. The problem is, you did stay. So did everyone. Because the fine print says, love this world, or be punished in the next. And the church helped co-sign that deal. They took the landlord's terms and turned them into sacraments, taught you to kneel, to obey, to give thanks for the rent you pay with your suffering. They said the world is good because God made it. And the Cathars said, "Are you sure? Because if the maker of this place is truly divine, then why is joy so rare and pain so common? Why does beauty rot? Why does goodness cost more than cruelty? Why does everything that feels real also feel like it's slipping out of your hands the moment you touch it?" The Cathars had an answer. The world's creator is not God. He's a lesser being, deluded, possessive, and obsessed with making you think there's no alternative. That's the real trick. Not temptation, not deception, just normalcy, the illusion that this place is all there is. And once you start to question that, once you read the lease, you realize you weren't trapped by evil. You were trapped by routine, by agreements made without consent, by silence mistaken for truth. The Cathars didn't fight the devil, they stopped doing business with him. They walked away from the lease. They gave up what the world told them to love, not because they were bitter, but because they finally understood the terms. So if you feel like something's off, like you signed up for a life that never quite fit, it's not failure, it's clarity. You were born into a contract you didn't write, and maybe it's time to stop renewing it. Freedom sounds like a spiritual word. It looks good on bumper stickers. It feels profound in sermons. But most religions, if we're honest, aren't really built to make people free. They're built to keep people manageable, predictable, focused on the right rituals, submitting to the right authorities, feeling guilty about the right things. And if all that obedience brings a little inner peace, great. But actual liberation, the kind that tears through illusion, upends power structures, and doesn't ask for permission, that's dangerous. That's heresy. The Cathars understood this. That's why they made everyone uncomfortable. They didn't just reject Catholic doctrine, they rejected the whole spiritual economy. They refused the very premise that holiness had to be mediated through hierarchy. No bishops, no confessionals, no golden altars, no one standing between you and the divine. Just a soul, a silence, and the long road of unlearning. And the church hated them for it, because a person who doesn't fear hell can't be manipulated with it. A person who doesn't believe in original sin doesn't need to be fixed. And a person who doesn't think the material world is sacred doesn't care how many relics you collect. The Cathars weren't rebellious, they were disinterested, and that made them impossible to control. Institutional religion depends on structure, on systems, on branding. It tells you how to be spiritual, and then sells you the kit. It gives you language, customs, a moral scaffolding to cling to when things fall apart. And for many, that helps. It soothes. It keeps the existential terror at bay. But it's not freedom, it's safety. And safety is not the same thing. Freedom, real freedom, comes when you realize you don't need intermediaries. You don't need titles. You don't need a weekly performance to prove you're worthy of grace. You already are. The Cathars taught that your soul came from light, and that everything trying to convince you otherwise, shame, punishment, fear, is part of the trap, not salvation, distraction. They didn't chant affirmations, they didn't sell incense, they didn't declare war, they just walked away, and if someone followed, they turned and quietly said, "You don't need us. Just remember." Of course, most people didn't. It's easier to feel calm than to be free. Calm is available. Calm is sold in 10-minute meditations and inspirational quotes on floral backgrounds. But freedom? That's earned. Through silence. Through letting go. Through facing the terrifying possibility that everything you've been taught about reality might be a lie designed to keep you spiritually pacified. So no, your religion might not want you free, not because it's evil, but because freedom is messy, and mess makes bad doctrine. But the Cathars weren't afraid of mess. They weren't afraid of silence. They weren't even afraid of death. They were only afraid of forgetting. Forgetting that your soul is not a project to be perfected. It's a light trying to escape. And if you've ever felt the itch beneath the calm, the tug behind the ritual, the holy suspicion that something deeper is calling you, that's not doubt. That's your freedom waking up. There's a certain kind of lostness that doesn't come from lack of direction. It comes from presence, being exactly where you're supposed to be according to everyone else, and still feeling like you've wandered off the edge of a map no one admits is blank. You show up to work, you answer your emails, you make the coffee, fold the laundry, pay the bills, return the texts. And somewhere in the middle of all that normal, your soul whispers, "This isn't it." You're not lazy, you're not broken, you're just misaligned. Like a compass in a magnetic storm, you keep trying to point towards something true, but every direction feels wrong. Because maybe, just maybe, this entire reality was never designed to hold your soul properly. The Cathars believed that the world wasn't just flawed, but foreign, not your home. A detour, a misfiled dream, a material realm forged by a being who mistook power for wisdom, structure for truth. To be clear, they didn't think the world was evil in the horror movie sense. It wasn't a haunted house. It was more like a badly written script, one where the characters forget their acting, the plot goes nowhere, and the exit signs have been painted over with motivational posters. And the moment you start waking up to that, the world begins to feel wrong. Familiar, but wrong, like trying to sleep in someone else's skin. But the Cathars didn't see that as failure. They saw it as the first step, the beginning of memory. Not of a past life, but of your real life. The one before flesh, before ego, before the noise. That strange ache in your chest, the yearning for something you can't name. That wasn't confusion, it was recognition. The problem is, when the world feels wrong, we assume we must be. So we medicate, we spiritualize, we blame our parents or our partners or our horoscope. We try new routines, new diets, new gods. But none of it works. Not really. Because none of it asks the question the Cathars dared to ask. What if you were never meant to thrive here? They didn't mean give up. They meant let go. Let go of the idea that your discomfort is a bug in the system. It's the system working exactly as intended, for someone else's benefit. You don't have to fix it, you don't have to win the game, you can choose to stop playing. That doesn't mean fleeing to the woods or becoming a recluse. It means remembering that this world's definitions of success, worth, and sanity are borrowed. And you don't have to keep pretending they fit. You're not lost. You're just standing still in a place that was never real. The map doesn't work because the destination was a mirage. But the good news is, you don't have to wait for directions. You can start walking. And if you feel that quiet pull towards something weightless, timeless, unnameable, follow it. That's not fantasy. That's home. You've heard the metaphor before. The divine is light, shining in the darkness. But the Cathars took it a step further. They believed the light wasn't far away, hidden behind some divine curtain or locked in a cosmic vault. It was here. Now, always. The problem wasn't absence, it was obstruction. You don't need to find the light. You just need to stop looking through layers of dirt and calling it vision. To them, your soul wasn't waiting to be filled. It was waiting to be uncovered. Buried beneath identity, trauma, fear, performance, loyalty to systems that never asked who you really were. The divine wasn't something you had to achieve. It was something you had to remember. Strip away the illusions, the stories, the ego's desperate need to be important, and what remains is the light, not borrowed, not granted, innate. But that's not how most religions teach it. You're told you're broken, flawed, fallen, that you need saving, fixing, redeeming. You're told your soul is dirty, your instincts suspect, your doubts dangerous. So you spend your life polishing mirrors that were never yours, hoping that if you try hard enough, some reflection will finally smile back and say, "You're worthy now." And every time it doesn't, you assume the light is gone. But it isn't. The dirt, the darkness, the weight, that's what was added, not what you are. The Cathars believed that this world was the dirt, the entire material realm, with its politics and poisons and pyramids of power, was a kind of divine smog. Not inherently evil, just wrong. A copy of a better truth. And your soul, it came from that truth. Not as a test subject or a prisoner, but as a spark. A flicker of something eternal dropped into illusion. The problem wasn't that your soul had fallen, it's that it had forgotten where it came from. That forgetfulness, they said, is the root of suffering. You identify with your name, your past, your body, your job. You confuse survival with meaning. You adopt roles and scripts and spiritual wardrobes, and each one piles on another layer of dirt. But the light is still there. You couldn't destroy it if you tried. And yet people do try. Every day. Not on purpose. They smother it under cynicism, addiction, self-hatred, busyness, approval-seeking. They think they've lost the light, so they buy replacements, success, pleasure, identity, even religion. But the Cathars warned that even spiritual effort can become another layer, another distraction, another tool of the false world. You can't reach the light by building toward it. You reach it by undoing, by emptying, by seeing clearly that you never lost anything. You just stopped looking through clean glass. And that's the risk, because once you realize the light never left, you also realize how much time you've spent chasing what was already inside you. You start grieving the energy wasted on self-improvement projects that never address the root problem, misidentification. You're not the dirt, you never were. The church, of course, hated this idea, because if the light is already within you, you don't need permission. You don't need rituals or middlemen or threats. You don't need to buy your way back into grace. You only need to look, honestly, patiently, silently, and that kind of seeing can't be taxed. So the Cathars taught not by preaching but by being. They lived simply, detached from the world's noise, so that people could see through them, like windows that had been cleaned of everything except light. And some people, upon seeing that, felt something stir, a memory, a recognition, not of the Cathars' teachings, but of their own forgotten brilliance. So no, the light was never gone, it was just waiting. And the only thing in the way? The dust you kept mistaking for yourself. You bought the books. You went on the retreats. You made the vision boards, followed the breathwork routines, drank the herbal teas with unpronounceable ingredients. You journaled. You healed your inner child. You forgave your ancestors. You meditated until your legs went numb and your thoughts kept spinning anyway. And now, you're exhausted. You're not alone. Spiritual burnout is real, not the kind where you lose faith and become a cynic. The kind where you've tried everything, followed every path, listened to every guru, and still feel like you're circling something you can't quite touch. There's a deep, gnawing tiredness that comes from seeking without finding, a spiritual fatigue that isn't rooted in laziness or doubt, but in the quiet realization that you've been looking so hard for so long, and the silence is still just silence. But here's the secret the Cathars might have whispered to you. That's not failure, that's progress. The spiritual path, if it's real, isn't supposed to energize your ego. It's supposed to unmake it. And that unmaking doesn't feel glamorous. It doesn't come with a golden aura or Instagram quotes. It often feels like collapse. Like everything you thought was meaningful is being peeled away. Like all the tools that used to work don't. And that's not a detour. That's the road. Because eventually, every seeker hits the wall. The prayers stop echoing. The rituals dry up. The affirmations feel hollow. The universe stops responding to your questions. That's the moment when most people think something's gone wrong. They backpedal, double down, or give up entirely. But the Cathars would say, welcome, you're finally getting close. In their view, the path to liberation wasn't about constant progress. It was about surrender, and surrender doesn't look like accomplishment. It looks like sitting in the middle of your broken tools, realizing they were never going to save you, and finally letting go. Not because you've given up, but because you've seen through the illusion. Burnout, in this sense, is a doorway. It strips away the idea that enlightenment is a product, or that the universe is a vending machine that responds to your spiritual loyalty points. It reveals the raw truth, that you are not here to master this world. You are here to remember you were never of it, and that remembering hurts. It breaks things. It breaks you. But not the real you, just the layer that thought it could win this game. The Cathars didn't chase mystical highs. They weren't looking for transcendence that glittered. They were seeking the slow death of illusion. And when the world stopped making sense, they didn't panic. They got quiet. Because the collapse of false meaning is not a tragedy. It's the beginning of clarity. So if you feel like nothing's working anymore, if you're tired of pretending the rituals still move you, it might not be because you're failing. It might be because you've outgrown them. The soil that once nurtured your growth is now just clinging to your roots. and letting go, while painful, is the only way to grow in a new direction. Your burnout may not be a sign to quit the path. It may be the moment you stop mistaking the path for the destination. And that silence you're hearing, that stillness that used to scare you, that's not absence. It's space, room for the light that was always buried under layers of trying. Somewhere in the collective spiritual imagination, there's a secret hope that the world will just end. Not because of nihilism or hatred, but because of exhaustion. Because this can't be it. The bills, the lies, the quiet compromises, the forced smiles and hollow rituals, the grief of watching the machine run smoother every year while souls run emptier. And beneath all that weariness, the hope whispers, maybe if it all burns down, something better can finally begin. Apocalypse becomes fantasy, not destruction, but deliverance. Maybe the stars align, maybe the veils part, maybe karma does the math, and the unworthy get exposed in dramatic fashion while the spiritually awake ascend into some better, brighter timeline. And the Cathars, oddly enough, might understand that fantasy. They too believed this world was coming to an end, just not the kind you can live stream. Their apocalypse wasn't fire and collapse, it was unmasking. A soft spiritual earthquake where the illusion of this world slowly crumbles. Not violently, but undeniably. They weren't waiting for plagues or cosmic battles. They were waiting for people to see through the lie. And here's the twist. When that seeing happens, you don't get rewarded with escape. You get clarity. And clarity isn't always comfortable. That's the thing most apocalypse fantasies forget. If the world ends and you're still carrying the same illusions, nothing changes. If you're still ruled by fear, still bound to identity, still grasping for meaning in the same old systems, then even paradise will feel like a prison. Because it's not the world outside that traps you, it's the one inside. The Cathars didn't stockpile supplies, they didn't build bunkers, they didn't speculate on end-time calendars or decode mystical numerology. They just lived like the world was already over, because in a way, for them, it was. Not in despair, but in release. They treated every day like a step out of the illusion. Every act of simplicity, every refusal to engage with the machinery of power was a small personal apocalypse, a way of saying, I no longer believe in this world's terms. And that's the real end of the world, when you stop playing by its rules. Not when the sky cracks open, when your loyalty shifts. You don't need collapse to wake up. You don't need to be rescued by cosmic drama. That's just another distraction, another way of putting off the hard truth, that your liberation doesn't need a global catastrophe. It needs your consent, which is why waiting for the world to end is often just spiritual procrastination. It lets you avoid the much scarier possibility that the thing you're waiting to be saved from is already inside you. And the thing you're waiting to be saved by is silence. So no, the end of the world won't save you. It might not even come. But the end of your agreement with illusion? That might, and it doesn't require a countdown, just a choice. You tried. Of course you did. You wore the right clothes. You learned the language of small talk and ambition. You worked hard to be pleasant, smart, normal, just the right amount of spiritual without sounding weird. You checked every box, met every deadline, smiled when you were supposed to, and when the silence came at night, you told yourself it was fine. This is what life is. This is how it's supposed to feel. Except it wasn't, and you knew that deep down, not in a loud way. In that quiet, chronic ache that makes you wonder why everyone else seems so convinced. That subtle misfit feeling, like you were dropped into the wrong movie halfway through. You weren't lost, you weren't broken, you were just out of place, like a soul fluent in a language the world stopped speaking centuries ago. The Cathars knew that feeling, they built their entire worldview around it. To them, the pain of not fitting in wasn't a failure of personality. It was evidence of spiritual memory, a sign that your soul still remembered a different kind of world, one where love wasn't conditional, where truth wasn't sold, where stillness didn't feel like laziness, and joy didn't have to be earned. The fact that this world feels unnatural isn't proof that you're defective. It's proof that you're awake. The system around you, economic, religious, cultural, it's designed for functionality, not authenticity. It wants you to produce, obey, believe, consume. It rewards conformity, not clarity. So when your soul starts asking strange questions, why am I doing this? Who told me this matters? What if I just stopped? You're labeled as restless, or depressed, or spiritually confused. But maybe you're not confused. Maybe you're finally beginning to see. The Cathars didn't offer solutions. They didn't promise that your soul would suddenly start feeling comfortable here. In fact, they taught the opposite, that discomfort is a teacher, that not fitting in isn't something to heal, it's something to honor. They believed your longing wasn't a flaw, but a compass, not pointing forward, pointing home. And that's the twist. The whole point wasn't to adapt, it was to remember, not how to survive here, but how to stop mistaking survival for purpose. You don't have to win the game, you don't even have to play it. You're allowed to stand still, to feel the ache, to listen for what it's trying to say. You were never supposed to feel at home in a world built by people who forgot what home was. So don't force yourself to belong where you were never meant to. Instead, belong to the ache, to the whisper, to the feeling that maybe this isn't all there is, and never was. The Cathars are gone, but the ache isn't. The quiet resistance isn't. The souls who walk softly through the world, doing no harm but refusing the illusion, aren't. You're not alone in your discomfort. You're not crazy for wanting more. You're not weak for needing silence. You are remembering. And the more you remember, the less the world fits. And the more you begin to see it for what it is. A place you passed through, not where you end. That feeling you carry, that homesick tug that keeps waking you in the middle of perfectly ordinary days, is not failure. It's not dysfunction. It's the map, the one they told you didn't exist. It doesn't come with street names or turn-by-turn directions. It comes as silence, as stillness, as intuition that makes no sense to anyone but you. You were never meant to adjust to this world perfectly. You were meant to carry the shape of another one inside you. So go ahead, feel strange, ask too many questions, sit still when the world demands motion. You don't owe it an explanation. You don't owe it your shape. You were never meant to fit in here, and that's the point. And now you know, not in your head, but in your bones. The kind of knowing that doesn't need convincing, that lives in quiet spaces. That won't be explained, only remembered. Like the distant sound of your own name in a forgotten language. You are not broken, you are ancient. And the light inside you? It never left. It only waited for you to stop pretending this place was home. So sleep now, or sit a little longer, in silence, in stillness, in the slow remembering of who you were before the world told you who to be. You're not alone in the dark. You never were. You were never meant to blend in with the illusion. You were meant to stand as a quiet reminder that something else exists, something gentler, freer, older than time. And when someone else feels that ache and sees you sitting calmly in it, they'll start to remember too. Not because you taught them, because you stayed, software, still, true. And maybe that's what salvation really is. Not leaving the world, just refusing to lie about it.